Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. Welcome, Imam Khalid. How are you today?
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Good, alhamdulillah. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. I'm so honored that you are able to join us. And I reached out to you because I know that you do a lot of work on the ground with domestic violence victims. And so we'd love to glean from your insight, wisdom, and experience on the topic. First of all, though, you have a very impressive list of qualifications. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, alhamdulillah. So my name is Khalid Latif. I serve as the University Chaplain at New York University. I'm also the Executive Director of NYU's Islamic Center. We have a fairly large, diverse community base here. It's about 4,000 Muslim students, as well as many people who live and work in the surrounding area that consider our space to be their community space. So altogether, we serve about 15,000 people or so. And that number goes up year on year. We have within that a lot of immense kind of talents, skill sets. And so we, beyond our Islamic Center, have sought to build out various other services and institutions, learning programs, charitable funds. Uh, but one of the nonprofits that we started out of our community is called Pillars of Peace, which is a domestic violence agency that provides advocacy, counseling, array of services, as well as a shelter for women and children who are survivors of abuse. Uh, and beyond some of that, um, I teach at our university's public policy school, courses on leadership. I involved in some different business ventures and other nonprofits as well.
MashaAllah, may Allah grant you tawfiq and barakah in all these incredible projects that you're doing. I'd like to start off where I heard you mention in a khutbah, you narrated some ahadith of Prophet ﷺ, where when people would come to him confessing that they, for example, consumed alcohol or committed zina, he would not get angry. And he was actually very merciful in his response. But when it came to a situation of somebody laying a hand, I don't know if it was upon the wife or whom, he became very upset. Could you expand upon that, please?
Yeah, I mean, there's a hadith in Al Adab al Mufrad where the Prophet ﷺ, essentially engages an individual who is abusing a young boy. And as he's doing so, the man says he hears a voice behind him, and the voice is saying, Allah has more dominion over you than you do over this child. And when he turns, he sees that it's the Prophet, alayhi salam, and anger is apparent on his face. And the man says, Ya Rasulullah, he's free from this, right? I've emancipated him from it. And the Prophet says, good, had you not done so, you would have burned in the fire like a flaming coal, leaving no room for any interpretation otherwise. And you can juxtapose this to other things, right? It's not to validate the engagement of haram in any capacity, but the gradations that we find hierarchically to some of these things and the consequential impact that's there in terms of what's taking place. There was a lot of instances where the companions would come to the Prophet struggling with a variety of issues, right? Islam is about reality. It's not about chasing after utopian-esque ideals that are intangible. And so they would come struggling with, drinking, struggling with zina. The Prophet would walk with them through their struggles. But when the Prophet, alayhi salam, would see somebody being oppressive, abusive, racist, the response to this type of haram was one where anger was something that was quite apparent on his face, his demeanor, and his voice, letting people know that there's no way that this should ever be an acceptable action.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. Are you able to define what is domestic violence? Does verbal abuse, is that included in that as well as emotional?
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about abuse, I think abuse in and of itself, categorically, people sometimes misconstrue what that might be. Um, Abuse is definitively physical violence, and that's a problem in and of itself. And we have hadith where Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha says, Lam yadrib Rasulullah imra'atan wala ghulaman wala waladan qat, that the messenger of God never struck a woman or a servant or a child ever. Um, and physical abuse in and of itself is an abhorrent practice. But beyond that, you can have financial abuse. We see this quite often when survivors of abuse reach out to us and they're in a place where they become stricken with anxiety and fear because someone is now manipulating control over them through finances as a mechanism. Emotional abuse is very much so a form of abuse and things people should be mindful of, right? Our tradition teaches us that our very limbs will speak on the day of judgment. May Allah grant us ease on that day. So you want to think about the number of children who have had adult emotions put into their children's hearts that are not ready to host that because they're hearing like yelling and screaming and experiencing it. You know, Maulana Rumi, rahmallah, he says, raise your words, not your voices. It is the rain that makes the flowers grow, not thunder. There's a lot of deep beauty in that statement, but also relevant here. You can have sexual assault and abuse, spiritual abuse. I mean, the range of forms of abuse that can exist are quite vast, but the thread that connects all of them, I would say, is a manipulation of power that's rooted in a desire to control. You know, somebody who has a power dynamic in their favor, leveraging that in an abusive manner towards one who is more underserved or underprivileged in relation to that power dynamic. And so verbal abuse would fall within the context of this as well.
How common is domestic violence in your community?
I mean, if we're defining community more broadly, you know, as Muslim community, or if we're talking about it in particular to the community that I serve at NYU in particular, I think it's hard to define because social media, technology allows for accessibility in a lot of different ways. And as much as we get contacted by people here in the New York City area, I also get people that reach out from all over the United States, from different parts of the world, who are looking for some just semblance of support or hope. I think the statistics that you find that are commonplace more broadly would very much so be applicable in the Muslim community experience as well, right? There's a good chance that if not an individual themselves, then someone that they know is likely gone through or knows someone who is a survivor of abuse, right? So when we're talking about 1 out of every 4 people is going to experience something in these ways, it's very likely that that's something that many people have seen or experienced themselves directly, unfortunately. And I would say in our community, it's not any different. As a chaplain, a lot of what I do is provide an opportunity for spaces of expression for people to just share some of the heaviness that they're carrying in their heart. And quite often you find challenging dynamics that become an inroad to exploring experiences that are happening either contemporarily or have happened previously that are categorically abusive in the ways that they are taking place. You know, adults now letting out from their hearts experiences that they had with family members when they were younger. You know, decades of physical violence, verbal abuse, emotional negligence, all kinds of things that just start to bear that impact inwardly on an individual.
So then jumping off that, would you then say that many of these people, the victims, they in a way accept the abuse or are enablers because of their childhood history? So it's almost kind of an extension of that, so they just take it?
No, I would say that you would never put the onus on the person who is being oppressed to somehow be the sole catalyst for breaking out of their oppression. And in our religion, we have what's called the farda'ain, the individual obligations. So your fajr is your fajr, my fajr is my fajr. You can't pray my fajr as much as I can't pray yours. But in order for me to know how to pray fajr, I have to learn that for myself or have someone teach it to me, because you can't do something you don't know how to do. That category of obligation is one grouping, but then we also have the fard kifaya, communal obligations. The quintessential example that's utilized is that of the janazah prayer, for example. If somebody passes away, it's a communal responsibility that that person's body is washed, shrouded, prayed over, and buried. And so long as one person in a community knows how to do this, then the entire community is absolved of the responsibility towards the deceased. But if no one knows how to do it, then the entire community bears the burden of responsibility towards those rights not being fulfilled. Social services, you could say, could fit into this category of the fard kifaya, where we have the interdisciplinary knowledge, we have the wealth, we have the resources. What's missing foundationally is either an awareness, knowledge base, or just the care and compassion to take care of those who are underserved and underprivileged, right? Like our Prophet ﷺ literally has people that live outside of his home who are stricken with poverty. The Ahl Sufa are people that are there. He's experiencing this. He's well versed in the needs of the people of his locale, as well as those who are of his ummah, and is in a place where that awareness and consciousness is now not manifest in just rhetorical discussions, but is manifest in actions and the encouragement of actions. And so if you're in a place where you have capacity to do, that's what we're judged on. And the person who's going through what they're going through is not meant to stand alone, but we're going to have to answer to Allah, not just about why we did what we did and didn't do what we didn't do, but we had the ability to do and still didn't get it done. And here, if there's women, children suffering in our communities because they live in houses that are anything other than homes, they're in places where they have these experiences, there's no room for intellectualizing that. You have to be able to build the resources that people are in need of so that they're able to break out of this. The experience that someone has is not something that if you haven't had it, you would be able to relate to other than through empathy. And if we were to define empathy within our spiritual kind of terminologies, I would say empathy is the complete suspension of the ego, the nafs, and everything that feeds and fuels it. And you're simply understanding the other through their lived experience. So you can't imagine the dissonance someone goes through, because no one enters into a relationship or is born into a relationship and thinks that a caregiver or caretaker is going to violate that. A child doesn't grow up thinking their father must be somebody who is abusive. They start to explain in ways for their own healing that has them try to make sense of a nonsensical situation as best as they can. Then there's not a lot of people who are talking about it from the member. There's not services that are educating people preemptively. There's not a sense of responsibility that gets kind of interjected within communities. And that person is left essentially to drown on their own. And while they're drowning, they have to figure out how to still somehow survive. And that's not on them. That's on us that we're not doing for them what we have the ability to.
Mhm. Imam Khalid, I read that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 women are victims of abuse, and 53% of American Muslims experience a form of domestic violence. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah. I mean, when you're looking at the statistics, 1 out of every 3 women is going to experience some kind of physical violence, sexual assault, rape, right? May Allah make things easy for them. And that's like an extreme violation, crossing boundaries. When you look at statistics also of men, you're looking at 1 out of every 4 men who are going through this, but an understanding that men were also children at one point in their life, right? We're talking about young boys, teenagers, people who are dealing with these types of realities. And what justifies and validates it are things that make fundamentally no sense, but it's very real. And understanding that the majority of people that you might share a prayer space with, a musalla you go to Jummah with, they are experiencing this kind of trauma in their lives, right? Religiously speaking, you're getting to a place where the abuser is completely antithetical now to what Tawheed really calls us to. And if we think about it from spiritual design and strategy, Shaitan wants you to believe that you are Malik, right? But Allah is Malik al-Mulk. Like, you are not al-Malik. You are not the one that has this authority and dominion and ownership over others. And that sense of skewed self translates now into this kind of harm that's happening to a good chunk of people. Like, literally, if you line people up, you're saying out of every 3 people, 1 woman is going through this, right? And that means if you have 300 women praying in your masjid on Friday, that 100 of them are experiencing or have experienced this in some capacity. How is that not a priority to then be taken care of in some way? Do you know?
So what do you advise we do? Because if we go to Jummah, we with all these people, we don't know what's going on behind closed doors. So what kind of responsibility do we have?
Well, I think checking in on people is important, and not assuming that we know everything, and creating accountability mechanisms as well as services, right? Like, for me, I don't believe Allah gave me a platform to be self-serving. And so I'm just trying to build as much as I can while I'm still in this world. Does that mean everybody has to do the same things that I'm doing? No, not necessarily, because we're all varied in terms of the spiritual gifts Allah has granted to us, the capacities that we have. But here in this kind of particular arena, I would say the strategy has to be one that you're still building with ihsan in some capacity. Because if we're not building with excellence, it doesn't mean that suddenly there's going to be men who have no idea what it means to be a man in the world. And you don't want to leave the beneficiary hanging, right? So building institutions with infinite mindsets, not finite mindsets. Like, I want to build a shelter that's here 100 years from now, inshallah, right? Not something that relies on me for its existence, because I could die tomorrow. And then what's going to happen? So getting groupings of people together who are like-minded and buy into these visions. And it's not something that's really improbable. We had a capital campaign in 2019 for the first shelter that we opened here in the Bronx in New York. It's emergency confidential shelter. Our residents will stay there for 3 months, either women alone or women who might have children, and equip them with a bunch of services. And the hope is to grow more. COVID came in the middle, and so that kind of had us pivot, and we were issuing micro cash grants and other things to people who are now stuck at home with their abusers, right? You can imagine what that must have been like 24/7. You're in a house now where at least you had some reprieve when someone was going to work or someone was going, to other places during the day. And so we had conversations. I reached out to relief agencies that I work with. I do a lot of humanitarian work in different parts of the world, in conflict zones and aftermaths of natural disaster. And so I had honest conversations with people. I said, would you want to partner on something, thinking about the longevity of a project? And a few people came back to me and said, nobody wants to really support domestic projects in the Muslim community. And to me, I just said, okay, well, I just now know that you're not someone I can work with on this, and figuring out who we can work with on it. And aside from the team we were building, like locally on the project for members of our community, in 2019, we had a capital campaign where I thought it would take us 6 months to a year to raise $700,000 to purchase and renovate a building. In 10 days, we raised, alhamdulillah, over $1 million from more than 9,000 unique donors, which was very affirming to me, but also gave me an insight that this touches a lot of different people in various ways that I knew theoretically, but on a practical level, the affirmations were things that you couldn't deny. And year on year, we've been able to help who we can in the capacity that we can, but it's still a long way to go. When we started that shelter project, what it snowballed into were other communities reaching out, asking, how do we do this? And to get to that place in 2019, we started to strategize towards the end of 2017 so that we were conceptualizing well in terms of the actual build out, right? Because good intentions are not enough. I speak at a lot of different things, and I've gone to communities that have good intentions, but when I look at how they've structured their organizations or even the amount of money they're trying to fundraise, I'll say there's no fundamental way you can be operating a shelter fully off of this budget. And when we sit down and we talk, they've cut different corners. They don't know what like the local policies are around some of these things. And that is going to, God forbid, create a challenge for the beneficiary class if it's not built in ways that are mindful and up to code and have like the security and insurance and policies that are needed. And so for me, like what I've learned is that to build well, you need to pay for your weaknesses, right? I don't have the capacity to do every single thing or know everything. I'm not a social worker. I am not able to provide psychotherapeutic care. I'm not an accountant. I'm not a graphic designer or a web developer. I'm not a lawyer, right? But it doesn't mean that there's not a ton of people who are these things, and where you can create interdisciplinary groupings of people and fashion then something that on paper makes sense. So the execution is something that then rolls out well. It allows for sustainable institutions that can then be replicated. And so these communities that reached out to us, we're able to provide consultation to them as well. Many Muslim communities in different cities. There was even people of other faith communities that reached out. People in the Sikh community reached out saying, you know, we should have something like this. People who were coming from different ethnic minority populations. And the whole idea is to kind of enable that precedent to build again as much as one is able to. It's just got to start somewhere, right? So if you all are in Allentown and I'm in New York City, and we're limited not based off of capacity in the long term, but in the interim, we have to figure out how do we get to step 10. Well, you could still rent a 1-bedroom apartment that if it's providing safe spaces to 2 or 3 people, that's better than nothing, right? And it's got a growth plan that has been thought out and strategized with professionals that can help understand how all of this comes together.
So if we don't have, I mean, this sounds like a very elaborate collaboration, mashallah, but if one doesn't have, for example, the financial resources to do such a thing, would you say that the least thing we could do is to direct them to, for example, an institution such as yours?
You can definitely send people to us, and there are a lot of different organizations that do exist throughout the country. They're not all Muslim run and Muslim influenced. And why we want to have Muslim run organizations is as much as we want to have other organizations that in this particular field cater to the nuance of the experience of the beneficiary, right? Can you imagine a woman who is deeply traumatized because she has been a survivor of physical violence in an abusive marriage for 15 years and now goes into a shelter where there's other people who also have gone through this, and she's waking people up at 3:30 in the morning because she's got to pray Fajr. Do you know? Like already it's creating a dynamic that's going to be difficult in like this shared space atmosphere. Do you see what I mean? And other things that come, we want to create ease, for the beneficiary and understand it with nuance. And that is not always found in places that don't have the cultural sensitivity, the language barriers that come up, but also they're not aware fundamentally of like the religious kind of backings of the people who are showing up because they're not catered to those specific demographics. Do you know what I mean? If a woman who has been beaten by her husband for a decade now goes to a place and prayer is not a part of her healing practice because the institution isn't built around that, it's going to not necessarily create as much ease as possibly could be, do you know? And I would also say that people actually have like a lot more money than they realize. Do you know what I mean? And that's what you fundamentally have to like think for yourself, because you don't help people because they're helpless, right? We're in a place where we can fundamentally do anything we want to. Do you know? We're just going to have to explain to Allah why we did it in the ways that we did it. And getting to a place where we make justifications for things that are not justifiable. And the rhetoric has to come from people who are authoritative, people who are in leadership roles, people who are speaking about these things. But I wouldn't agree with the idea that people don't have the money to do it. Do you know? Like the people who have the money might not be compelled to give it, but they're going to have to explain to God why, right? Like this is what the hadith tells us. You know, you can have as much money as you want. You're just going to have to answer how you attained it and what you spent it on. Do you know? And you spent it on X and supposed to Y. Well, why would you do that? Do you know what I mean? And inevitably, if you say yes to something, it means you're going to say no to something else. How is this something to say no to? Do you know? Like, how does that make any sense beyond anything else? Like, what could somebody say to God on the day of judgment? May Allah grant us ease on that day. That I know that a third of my community is experiencing something, and I still thought it made more sense for us to buy a chandelier for the masjid, do you know, or like extend a parking lot in some capacity. And I'm not faulting anybody, but at some level, like the expansions of these things have to come to a place where we do realize how much talent we have and how much wealth we have and what we're fundamentally doing with it.
Food for thought, indeed. I'd like to pivot to the ayah in Surah Nisa, which I think it makes, to be frank, and I'm very wary of even mentioning this for fear of being blasphemous. It does make many women feel uncomfortable when they read that ayah about nushuz and disobedience to the husband, and then about the word beat or hit being used. Can you explain that to us, please?
Well, I think what we want to think out is a few different things, right? One, the Quran in and of itself as a text is going to be just like any other text, something that we can engage in uh, exegetically, right? Like I take meaning from the text. That's what tafsir is, or eisegetically. Like I formulate an argument and I then pick verses in hadith that validate my argument. And that's what a lot of people do, is more eisegetical than exegetical. And the challenge with that is then you can turn a book into whatever it is that you want to. So are there opinions that one can find, not even just contemporarily, but classically, that would say domestic violence has no presence in Islam and that this verse cannot mean that? They are. And the choosing of empowering opinions that are alternate to that is a very conscious decision that some people make. So, seeing how the book in itself entirely speaks to itself, one could very easily make the argument that there's no fundamental way that this verse actually validates the abuse from a husband to a wife. And if you have a starting point that then engages at that level, you're able to then look at it through different parameters, right? The word nushuz is applicable in this verse to the behavior that's coming from a wife to a husband. But whoever gets to a place where they're having like the conversation that speaks about other verses that talk about that same concept in relation from a husband to a wife, where do we get to a place where we're able to deepen in what the plethora of opinions are that are there, including many mufassirin who would say that domestic violence is not permitted in Islam? And why are those words not choosing to be empowered? I think here there's a challenge that what one sees as a permissibility is actually meant to be what it is in and of itself, uh, uh, a condemnation like of these behaviors and these actions. And you get to a place where, unfortunately, individuals are able to validate ill behavior in these ways. I don't know like where people who are listening methodologically lie on the spectrum of various ideologies within our broader tradition. But this is where sometimes people just have to go very deliberately to the Quran and the Hadith and see like how was this actually manifest and lived by the Prophet of God. And that's why the seerah is something that's so important because it makes Quran concrete. It doesn't leave room for doubt. And when you look at hadith, like the one that I mentioned before, Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha is saying definitively, right? Lam yadrib Rasulullahi imra'atan wala ghulaman wala waladan qat, that the messenger of God never struck a woman or a servant or a child ever. He is the epitome and the actual manifestation of this text. And arguing otherwise is a deep problem, I would say.
Well, that being said, I know the hadith. I must say, though, that when you do look at that ayah, it seems to be more like a step-by-step process, i.e. it's not this is the reality of what's happening in our community, and this is the process and how you should follow through. And so then that brings the question that why would that be there? Like, can you imagine if any layperson picks up the Quran and looks at that ayah, they would assume that that's the way to go, because that apparently that word to strike or hit, that's what it is. So I think I'm just seeking more clarity because I personally have not really come across something that's been very clear on this specific topic.
Well, when you're looking at the broader steps that are there, separation, these kinds of things, they have like a wisdom to it, but I wouldn't read that verse as saying that it's advocating for someone to strike another human being. And that's what I'm saying. There are opinions that would say that that's not the case, that domestic violence is not permissible in any way, shape, or form. And you're saying that you haven't heard those things before is exactly what I'm saying is the problem, right? We frequent spaces and we frequent communities where the default assumption is one that is heavily skewed in this misunderstanding, right? Like I was speaking in a men's only gathering and I shared instance of a young woman who was being abused in her home and was looking for some support. And I put forth to this gathering of men who were from 18 to probably 50 or 60. And I said to them, if this woman came to you, like, how would you help her? And as we went around from group to group, I broke them up into like groups of 5 to 10. The first 2 or 3 groups responding in the debrief said, we would find out like, had she done something, that warranted this response. And immediately I said, you're already like indicating why your socialization yields like impact towards the problem being prevalent. There's nothing that someone can do that validates or warrants that kind of behavior towards them. And the assumption that comes in that that's something that is a valid frame of understanding. What did she do that she was then hit by somebody is a part of the consciousness that exists, not just within Muslim communities, but in communities across the board. Think about how minority demographics are engaged, right? Like if you go to a university in this country and there's an academic department of gender studies, the gender studies is going to typically be talking about everything other than like what it means to be male, right? You go to departments on like race and ethnic studies. It's not talking about like what it means to be white. It talks about everything other than what it means to be white. Many of these places are pitting studies that don't then analyze the majority privileged demographic in the ways that they should be engaged and understood to be able to then think about how it is that they misuse power in different ways. And so here you have now a prevailing default mindset that creates now a dynamic that just supposes that that's what the reading of this should actually be. And that's not what our tradition is teaching us in any way, especially from the mode in which the prophet of God is practically manifesting these things.
So you're saying that the issue lies in a lack of knowledge and a lack of thorough interpretation by people in religious leadership?
Well, I think partially if there's people who have been entrusted with information, the number of messages that I've gone to where I've spoken about domestic violence, I've spoken about some of these realities, and people have said to me afterwards in, you know, private settings, like, you can't speak about these things in our space. I'd say, why? And they'll say, the number of donors that we have in our community that are abusive of their families, their wives, is a lot. And if you talk about how domestic violence is haram, they're going to stop donating to the masjid. And I said to them, like, you should not be a caretaker of a mosque, right? Like, that's not a mindset that one should have in your role. And two, like, how will you answer to Allah in this? Like, you know what is problematic, you know what is wrong, and you're making validations of things that are undeniably not justifiable in pursuit of what? Like some portion of the world or some fear of losing some aspect of it. But this is how like power dynamics function, right? And you get to a place where things generationally just pass down and they have assumptions that are there. I was in Sri Lanka working with internally displaced populations on the ground. So twice over, the Tamil Tigers had evicted large numbers of Muslims from their home communities. And as we were meeting with people who were now essentially living in the wilderness, one of the groups that I met with were just women who were part of this internally displaced population. And we had an hour where we were sitting. And the first thing one of the women said to me was, can you tell us something from the Quran and the Hadith that we can tell our husbands so that they stop hitting us? That was like the nature of the conversation right from the beginning. In my mind now, I'm with these people just for a bit, and I have to be prudent in my words, but also understand that when I leave, they're still going to go talk to these guys who are hurting them, right? So where do we have an opportunity for empathetic listening that allows for them to have a release and a reprieve, understand where text is in their favor, and also think out like what are a strategy point, right? And as we sat there together and I heard from them what they were saying, we started to piece out how it is we can shift things of normalcy within the kind of experience that they were in. One of what was necessary was saying that you should have like women from your community who are going to also gain knowledge, that are going to be able to offer words back to those who are using text against them, right? And this is just objective fact. I mean, religion becomes a boys' club, do you know? And we have tons of people who are stuck in abusive marriages because religious scholars are not helping people in the ways that they should, right? The husband is the person who is prominent in the community, or, you know, you should just be more patient, sister. It's like, no, that's, who are you to do that with the knowledge you've been given? Do you know? And it does then have a cyclical kind of pattern that gives weight to these kinds of things. A healthy home becomes the necessary ingredient for healthy communities. Do you know? And if somebody's coming to pray in your jama'ah and they're physically hurting from abuse, what do you think is doing to their soul and to their heart? Do you know? And how are they passing down precedent in different ways? I've sat down with enough people that it's not anecdotal, who have told me that they believe that their husbands are going to be unfaithful to them, you know, and that that's just a given. How do we create a generation of people who have this kind of mindset, that abhorrent behaviors start to become commonplace and validated? And I would say, yeah, like religious scholars play a key role in being able to speak out against things like forced marriage, like domestic violence, and telling people what it is that they have accountability towards, not just focusing on the person who is the survivor of abuse, but speaking to the abuser and saying, you're going to stay in front of God. Like, what are you going to do on that day? Right? Like, every place you struck someone, their cheeks are going to speak on the day of judgment, right? Your hand is going to speak about how you used it. Do you see what I mean? And all of those things have to be understood in the context of text, right? Like, if you can envision the Sirah as like a 10,000 piece puzzle, you know, and every piece to the puzzle makes up a different hadith or narration of our tradition. You wouldn't say if somebody could put together like two pieces of that puzzle, they were an expert in the puzzle. Or if they knew like some of these pieces fit in this corner, but not really how they fit together, they'd have to be able to put the whole thing together to make sense of it. This is how like the Sunnah and the Sirah relate to each other. You have all of these individual narrations that make up an entire image when it's all pieced together properly. And we got a lot of people who only know how to put a couple of pieces together that are then speaking as if they have the entire image that is forefront. And it does a disservice to, you know, our religion, but also like our Prophet salam, claiming that we are speaking on his behalf or God's behalf in ways that are just fundamentally contrary to the overarching ethos of what the religion calls towards.
It's very disillusioning to hear this, and I find it outrageous what you were told by that masjid. So there's so much work to be done. What would you say about men who are victims of domestic violence? For example, I come across several men who have been abused by their wives, but they always say they can't really say much because the law is on the woman's side and the children become a pawn. So they have or will lose their children. And there's one particular person that comes to mind who was in a relationship where his wife would scratch him, spit in his face, take his wallet, and has actually like smashed a device that he had. And at one point he felt that I need to call the cops because he would never hit her and abuse her. But it was reaching a point where he was worried that she would feign being abused and he would be in even bigger trouble. And so these men remain silent. And it's like, even if I asked them to come and talk on this podcast, they won't. They won't.
Well, it's hard, right? I mean, if somebody's going through a traumatic experience, I don't know the people particularly that you're talking about.
Well, they're now divorced, but this is the whole thing, is that they have no way to bring this to light. And what's even more concerning is that the abuser, on more than one occasion, are actually in the mental health profession, the mental health field. And on top of that, for example, being certified in an Islamic studies program. So they have sort of social rank in the community. And people have absolutely no idea that this is what was going on in the home.
Well, I mean, you know, there's a few things that are there, right? I think that's where having services and institutions and educational awareness, because when we're catering to the lowest common denominator, and I can stand in an audience that has 20 people or 20,000 people, does every single person in the audience have to hear what I'm saying through a place of relatability? No, sometimes what we say is just so that that one person in the audience knows that they're not alone and that there's opportunity for them to get out of something and break out of something, because you have all kinds of elements that people exist in cycles of shame. You know, they have kind of culturally hegemonic attitudes towards religion, skewed understandings of gender, that shaitan gets us where we're vulnerable, right? Alladhi yuwaswisu fi sudur nas is about getting me where I'm insecure, not where you're insecure, because we're autonomous individuals. And these men don't have support systems as well. And the abuse that they sustain is not just spousal, which is a thing that can happen, right? That men are abused by their wives and mistreated, physical violence, emotional violence, these kinds of things. And speaking to the right persons is important, So communally, what do we have a responsibility towards? We have a responsibility of learning what the actual resources are and referral systems are. So someone comes to me and says to me that, hey, I'm having this issue, right? It's not just I'm going to do whatever I feel like. If I'm not trained, I have to talk to the people who are trained if I'm going to be the supporter, or get them to the right people who can help them with like safe exit plans and strategies. So you're not running out of your home and you've left behind now all of your credit cards and cell phones and traceable like mechanisms, because an abuser will follow you to where you go. You speak to someone who's a lawyer who can tell you why you should document things. So someone's getting scratched in their face and they're able to take a photograph, file a police report, but you're talking to people who are people of knowledge within that discipline that help you get to a place where you have the capacity to be able to move forward in ways that are not creating that much more of a challenge for you, right? Like, who is talking to these people about, what are the different types of civil divorces that exist? What does it mean to be a custodial parent? How do you kind of navigate the specifics and particulars of, publicly mentioning that your wife is an abuser and the impact that can have on the emotional development of a child? It doesn't mean that people aren't aware of these things, right? But when you have communal experience that quite often only empowers certain people to speak on all things Islamic, and that's not their skill set or their tradition, right? I had a teacher who studied usul for 7 years, mashallah. He knew Islamic legal theory inside and out. And in front of me, someone asked him a question about a flyer. And he said, I don't know anything about graphic design. Like, why are you asking me this question? Do you know? But the go to would be, again, back to the person who's responsible. This man comes to ask someone, and that person doesn't know what they're talking about. They either will have one of a few scenarios. They'll have not taking this person's personal narrative in vain and say, I have to get trained up on this. I have to know how to build a referral system. Who do I connect somebody to and get them the help that they need? Or they're going to tell them something that's just not going to be helpful. But then the support is more like nafsi. Like, I'm giving you an answer to not support you, but to make me feel at ease that I've given you something. And that's not going to be helpful to either one of us. Or there's not like continuity, right? Like, we had a conversation and that's it. Like, what's the next step that's there? And bringing in those people like in communities that do have these skill sets, that do have these talents, and that they're vetted, and there's some mechanism that just isn't like, oh, you said you're a good like counselor, so we'll just give this to you. But background checks, insights, because you're exposing people to a very vulnerable demographic, you need to ensure that they have the capacity to actually honor some of those things, right? And it's hard. And there's a lot of people who just are right now living miserably because we haven't created the support mechanisms for them to break out of something. Because what would the alternative be? And these are very heavy thoughts for someone to have. I might not ever see my kids again, and that means I just have to put up with this. And they're repeating the thoughts. They're going through it again and again. We think 12,000 to 70,000 thoughts a day. 4 out of 5 of those are negative, and 96% are repeat. So we're using 4% of our thought processes through like conscious, wakeful, like that's what like taqwa could be, like that 4%, and 96 is just compounded. So this poor guy is in a place where he's doubting his masculinity. He's in a place where he didn't expect, this to happen. And now he's also thinking like, I'm going to lose my babies, right? And he's got no one to speak to about it. That's not an easy thing. And yeah, like, you can refer people to various organizations, but someone's got to do that legwork and look in the local area. What are like the mental health practices? What are the domestic violence agencies? What are the resources that are there so that we're getting people the assistance that they need?
Yeah, and it is complex because people are terrified of losing their children. And it becomes particularly more difficult when the perpetrator, she might be somebody who's very eloquent, very sharp, witty, knowledgeable about the mental health field, and can totally portray the other person to be a liar and crazy, you know? So that's terrifying.
Yeah.
Such
And
a
that's
risk.
that's
Yeah.
really hard, right? And that's where like privilege comes in various forms, do you know? So we have entire kind of experiences in front of us that show that those things are possible. Our tradition teaches us that a day of judgment is also where everything is going to be made balanced, do you know? And so Asya, may Allah be pleased with her, is a quintessential example of the individual who is in an abusive relationship, right? Fir'aun is her husband, but not teaching that intangibly or in a way that's just kind of entertaining, but the reality that she sustains what she sustains and she's elevated in a hereafter sense. And Allah sees what's taking place with all of these people. You know, he's there with you, he knows what's going on, and he's going to make balance what is imbalanced in his kind of divine wisdom and knowledge. And Allah grant us ease on a day of accounting, because everybody's going to have to just fess up to what it was that they did, you know. And that person who is gifted with eloquence and articulation, they're going to be asked, why did you use it to manipulate in this way?
Imam Khalid, have you ever seen a perpetrator who has changed?
Yeah, I mean, everyone has capacity to change, and I have seen people change, but change doesn't mean that forgiveness isn't still a right of the forgiver as opposed to a responsibility. So you can change and still not have the blessing of the person that you abused in your life, right? And why I would say that is because we don't want to mince words. We don't want to be in a place where we give platitudes to people who are living in real hell and say that, well, someone can change, just be patient, right? This is a test from God. Be patient. Why is God testing a 10-year-old girl whose father beats her? Do you know? Like, you're giving people words that have no substance to it. Do you know what I mean? So people can change and they have capacity to change, and that's fine. But it's not as if that becomes a justifier of saying, let's just wait for that person to change. Do you see what I mean? And sometimes that's what fundamentally needs to happen. They lose their kids, they lose like their communities, they lose their families, their friends. And it's a wake up call that enables them to own up to the behaviors that they have. Do you know?
Have you seen a happy ending though, of where somebody has actually become more self-aware and realized, oh my goodness, I'm doing this to my family, and has made amends, and it's now a very functional situation?
I have, yeah. But I think again, I'm not saying because I qualify it only because we don't want anecdotal experience to be something that someone who's listening or watching becomes a justifier again for ill behavior. Do you know? Like, you don't have to wait for someone to be the best version of themselves for you to break out of something that's abusive, right? Those two things can both be valid. That potential is there. And this is what happens quite often. I sit with people every day, right? As a chaplain, a lot of what I do is just listening to people. And what I've taken from it is that people have their individual strengths and non strengths. And quite often we are listening to respond to people as opposed to listening to understand, and become too solution oriented rather than validating people's feelings and what they're going through. Why don't you try this? Why don't you do that? Sometimes it's not about telling somebody to do something or not do something. Sometimes it's just about carrying some of the heaviness they're holding so they don't have to hold it by themselves. And then they are enabled to make decisions and choices that they find themselves in. So, yes, I could put you in front of 10 people who go through this, and there would be some who have been able to reconcile and choose to try to see where those things work out. And there's also a lot of people who it doesn't work out. And both of those things can be true. We don't want to be in a place where what's in front of us isn't defining how decisions are made going forward. Do you know?
Yes, I 100% agree with you that we need to have more environments where people can feel that they're being held, like there's someone to hold space for them, because it's quite bizarre that people have to pay a therapist in order to have someone listen to them. So I totally agree with you in that. And also what I'm taking from you is how important it is for the perpetrator to be called out, because nobody is standing up and saying, men treat you, this is absolutely unacceptable, or women, you can't do this to your husband. And it's this deafening silence on this topic. So I hope and pray that that can change with awareness, and maybe by just the layman like myself to possibly request those things from our seniors in our community or people in leadership, I suppose.
Yeah, and that's valid, right? I mean, I've had people come up to me before Jummah in our community and have said, you know, um, my father is here who abuses my mother. Can you talk about this in Jummah today? And like 2 minutes before I'm going to give the khutbah, I'm like, of course, right? Like how could I say no? Do you know what I mean? Like what could fundamentally be something other than, yeah, like this is what I'm going to talk about, and I will. And I to speak to your point, right? Like after the fact, the sister will come and say, no one has ever done that for me before. And I'll say, I'm sorry. Like it shouldn't be a rarity. It should be the norm. And then the father will have some like reflection and contemplation on some of these things. Um, and then it's about how do we have ongoing support in those, right? It's not like a one-off, like, oh man, I heard this khutbah and that's great. But getting people to be where they need to be in these situations requires doing this with a sense of care and compassion that says it's got to be also when it's not convenient. Do you see what I mean? So one part to a broader strategy, but that's a very important part, right? Like how many times do you go to any gathering? Like Jummah, let's say, is even 30 minutes a week. That means you have 26 hours of exposure to some kind of content in person. And if you ask your average person, like what it is that they're learning and taking away from their Jummah experience, most of them probably are not retaining anything of it, right? That's not to knock anybody, but that's a reality. It's not like being utilized in the ways that it could be utilized. And here, especially, like the ethics, the values that go into all of this, you know, they're not being discussed. And you have an entire community that is being impacted by the absence of certain types of information, and then the default that they're getting societally is a hypersexualized society that objectifies women in a lot of different ways, that creates notions that, just because I fathered a child, that means I could do whatever I want, right? Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma, he says that people are called abrar, the dutiful ones, the ones who give bir, because they understand there's a right from the parent to the child as well as from the child to the parent. Like it goes in both directions. Do you know what I mean? um yeah, so yeah, like you should be telling people, and there should be mechanisms to have that kind of feedback, and it then has an impact on people.
Imam Khalid, is anything you'd like to say in closing?
No, I appreciate the opportunity.
If you
And
say there's somebody out there right now who is suffering and listening to this, what would you say to her? Or even to him, actually?
Uh, well, one, I would say, right, the gross majority of people who are survivors of abuse are women, and that's things that we should understand. But there are men who have gone through abusive situations. It's not all just kind of spousal. There's a lot of young people. Like if you have a husband who's abusing their wife, there's a good chance that that husband is also abusing their daughters and their sons in some capacity. Do you know? But I would say to the person who's going through this, you don't have to go through it by yourself. You don't have to make sense of something that's nonsensical. And we're here for you in whatever ways that you need. If I can ever be helpful to anyone in anything you have going on, feel free to reach out, and we'll connect you to the resources that are needed. And I would say to everyone who is listening beyond that, no one's going to build for us what we have to build for ourselves. And you have to be in a place where you have the confidence and at times the bold audacity to not just fall in line with what everybody else is doing. And if you can interject into your community a shift in mindset that says that this is a priority, then even if you have to think about it in a way that what's the benefit to you, all of the ajr comes back to you for initiating now a new trajectory that's calling people towards something that's good and definitively forbidding something that's wrong. So where we can build, leverage your skills and your talents, sit down with people together and envision like bold visions that say we should be able to build these types of resources and these services and empower people to get it done. If you are a man that's listening to this, it's something that you might already assume, but there's an absence of men that work in this space. And where men take up a lot of room in a lot of spaces, objectively speaking, you got to step up and think about it. So if you've ever had the difficult reality of seeing your mother get abused, if you know of people in your life, families, extended family members, right? You want to do for them, bring an intentionality that is rooted in love, real mahabba, that has you thinking about the world's forgotten people. And the outcomes of it, inshallah, with good intentions, will be that we build with excellence and we help a lot of people. You know, I took my son Kareem and my daughter Medina to the shelter that we've opened in the Bronx here. And while it was renovating, you know, I walked them through the house and we looked at the bedrooms that were empty and whatever else, and explained to them this is who's going to be living in this space. And on our way down, we stopped in one of the bedrooms and my son looked into it. And then he came out. He's now 8. He was probably 6 when this was happening. And he looked at me and he said, Baba, are there going to be kids that live here as well? And I said, yes. And he said, Baba, I think they're going to be really happy here. And I said, Kareem, inshallah, they will be happy. And inshallah, will help them to live lives where they can have the same happiness that you're blessed to have, you know? And my child can see it. Do you know what I mean? And we have to sometimes tap into that sense of responsibility and potential. And then when we stand in front of Allah, we can say to the best of our ability, you know, inshallah, that, Ya Rab, we tried our best to fulfill the purpose for which you created us. And the last thing I'll say, you know, I told you before, I don't have anything to say. If you are hurting someone right now, you need to stop it. And I say it with care and love. You're not going to be ready for what happens to you when you stand in front of Allah. If any part of you thinks that it's okay for you to abuse, hurt, mistreat somebody, make sure that you are dealing with that mindset right now. We are going to stand in front of our God and be taken into account for every single thing that we did. Every single action is being written down. You do not want to stand in front of Allah in a place where people who are oppressed are now speaking against you because you were their oppressor. People who are abused are now speaking against you because you were their abuser. You have the capacity to change and stop this. It has to come from a recognition from within yourself. And even there, if there's things that we can do to help, let us know. Inshallah, we'll be able to get through all these things together.
Imam Khalid, I want to express my deep appreciation and also admiration for the work that you are doing. And I make dua that you and everybody else that is in this field of work, that Allah grants you tawfiq, and may the good that comes of it be far, far reaching. Ameen, Ya Rab. So I would like to, if you at some point could share the information with me. So I'd really like to encourage our listeners to support your venture and to donate generously as well, inshallah. Jazakallah khair for your time. I really appreciate it.
Okay, Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Assalamu alaikum.